Ukrainian flags are once again flying over several key cities in the northern Kharkiv region for the first time in 5 months, after a massive counteroffensive over the weekend forced Russian troops to retreat. Kremlin military officials acknowledge leaving nearly all of the region you see here in blue, a defeat that experts say could be a decisive moment in the 200-day war. Since the offensive began, American military officials estimate around 500 Russian troops have been killed or wounded each day. And while estimates of Ukraine's losses vary greatly, tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are believed to have been killed or wounded since the war began. And clearly, it is not over. I'm joined by Tom Nichols, an international affairs expert, staff writer at The Atlantic, and author of its Peacefield newsletter, and Carol Saivetz, a senior advisor for MIT's Security Studies program, research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and the Harvard Ukrainian Institute. It's good to see both of you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks.
Carol, do you mind if I ask you, repeat what you asked Tom right before we went on the air?
No, what I asked Tom was whether or not he thought he'd see what we're now seeing with this rout of the Russian forces and the major Ukrainian successes in the region around Kharkiv and even going into the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
What's your answer to your own question, Carol?
I'm surprised. Frankly, I've been sort of cheering the Ukrainians on, and I have to be honest about that. But I think it really shows up what many of us have been saying all along about the lack of preparedness, the lack of understanding the battlefield, the corruption and everything else that has been afflicting the Russian military from the beginning. There are stories today that the Russian generals are upset and that Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the head of Chechnya, who's one of the major fighters, and says, well, he's going to tell them how it really is. They just don't understand. And Putin apparently canceled a big meeting today with the military leadership.
So, Tom, you can answer her question if you choose. But in addition, do you see this as just a one-time heartening moment for democracy or potentially a war-altering one?
Well, there's two things. One is I didn't expect to see it at the beginning of this war because there were things that were going on that really were happening layers deep in both the Russian and the Ukrainian militaries. One of them that I think we didn't expect was how quickly the Ukrainian military could do things like develop a non-commissioned officer corps and start getting up to Western standards in the space of only 7 or 8 years, which isn't that long. The other is I think we really underestimated the degree to which the Russians had impoverished their own military basically by just stealing money out of the defense budget and the immense corruption that was behind the defense budget that doomed their whole attempt to create a more professional army. So yeah, in that sense, I didn't expect to see this. I'm somewhere in between the idea that this is the ultimate turning point of the war or that it's not that big a deal. It's a big deal. This is a really big deal to have the Russian military fleeing its positions and leaving its equipment behind so fast that the Ukrainians couldn't keep up with the Russians running in front of them. But this war is, and Jim Stavridis, the former NATO commander, said this as well. This war isn't even close to over. The only people that can decide when this war is over, the only person who can decide when this war is over is Vladimir Putin. And he has to make a decision to stop throwing bodies and iron into this meat grinder that he set up his troops for. So it's a great day. It really gives a lift that the Ukrainians needed, but this isn't even close to over yet.
Is it war-altering, Carol?
Maybe temporarily. I share some of Tom's hesitation about this. I think it changes the contours of the battlefield short to medium term, but we don't know how Vladimir Putin will respond and what he will do next in terms of redressing some of the damage that's been inflicted on the Russian troops. And I also worry, I'm changing the subject a little bit, I also worry about the people back home in Russia who are angry at Putin, but not because he started the war, but angry because it wasn't prosecuted well. And will there be even more pressure on Vladimir Putin to up the ante even more than we've already seen?
Well, let me change the subject since you changed the subject, but not totally. When you two were here, either last time or the time before, I asked you, when would this war be over? And you hinted at it a minute ago, Tom, when you said, when Putin's over, when he's gone. Does this help build momentum on this effort when they suffered such an embarrassing failure in this region, starting with you, Tom?
Well, the problem in trying to ever predict the fall of a Kremlin leader is that it seems impossible right up to the moment it happens.
Right.
And so it's very hard to determine how a coalition might form against him when he's been very good about making sure, I say very good, very competent as a former spy, making sure that those coalitions can't form against him. But one thing I'd look for here is to see who Putin decides to shift the blame onto. If he really does say, now I'm going to start really, imprisoning military officers or, really go after the security services, that could change the calculus. But I also share Carol's worry that the answer is going to be not that we should depose Vladimir Putin, that the answer in Russia won't be to depose Putin, but to get a bigger hammer.
Carol, everything I read in the last few days has said that this success in the Kharkiv region is going to put pressure on the West to provide more weapons because, one, the weapons that are provided have worked. Apparently, United States intelligence had something to do with this success. But right before this, we saw not just Republicans, but some Democrats balking at, I think, what was a $14 billion Ukrainian request by Joe Biden. So will this help encourage the West, including the U.S., to do more? Or are we settling back into a difficult morass here?
To be honest, I could guess either way. I could guess that there'll be some people who say, well, look at the successes they've had. Why do we need to provide them with any more weapons? And I could see other people saying, let's keep the momentum going. Let's, push the Russians out of Ukraine once and for all. And therefore, we need more weapons. When Tom was talking about the things that were unexpected, I think one of the other things that was unexpected was the ability of the Ukrainian forces to assimilate all the Western technologies so fast and to use them so successfully.
How about you, Tom? What's your sense of what this does in terms of Western support?
I think it's hard to argue it's hard to argue against more support, given that part of the reason they're having this breakthrough is because of weapons like HIMARS, like the long-range artillery system that we've been sending. If this were the Ukrainians just kind of fighting trench warfare with picks and shovels and winning, you might make the argument that they, maybe they don't really need that kind of money. But the money that we've been putting into Ukraine is showing actual results. And anyone in Congress who's sitting through a classified briefing right now is being shown exactly how that money is helping to win these battles. So, I still think that there will always be Republicans who just dig in their heels. There's always going to be a Rand Paul out there. But I think it's a pretty hard argument to make that this isn't a good case for sending more money, because the money we've sent clearly is having an impact.
Just to be clear, though, I understand your Rand Paul reference. What I was referencing last week, prior to all this, included a significant number of really high-ranking Democrats in Congress as well. Speaking of putting pressure on the West, it seems to me it puts pressure on Putin to put pressure on the Western alliance. And one of the things that it's allegedly being contemplated is retaliating by cutting off energy supplies to the West. Here's what Secretary of State Blinken had to say on Friday about the Western alliance and this threat from Putin.
President Putin is betting that these actions will break the will of countries to stand with Ukraine. He's betting that the Kremlin can bully other countries into submission. He's already lost that bet.
Has he lost that bet, Carol, or is that a risky proposition for people in Western Europe worried about being cold and broke this winter?
I think the alliance has held together much better than I would have expected when this all started last February. I do worry, though, that if there's a full shut off of natural gas and oil from Russia to the Europeans, and if it's a bitterly cold winter, that there could be some more demonstrations, some pressures on the West European governments, much as there was that demonstration in Prague, I think it was last week or the week before, against the government, with forces both from the right and the left of the Czech political spectrum arguing that the Czechs should give it up and buy gas from Russia because prices were getting too high, et cetera. So I think that that is still what Putin is counting on. But thus far, the European alliance has held very well. And the German foreign minister, I think it was in Kiev over the weekend. I mean, there's still this real demonstrable show of support for the Ukrainians from the Europeans.
When you say thus far, though, thus far has been warm, and obviously the future.
No. That's
yeah.
You're right. That's exactly my concern. If it's a terrible winter, I think we could see much more pressure on the European governments unless they figure out a way ahead of time.
You know, Tom, you wrote a really interesting piece. I said, you do know, but I thought it was a really interesting piece when you interviewed a colleague about what you called the sheer sadism of the Russian assault on the Ukrainians. As someone who has no expertise in war, unlike you two, I assumed all wars were brutal. All wars included sadism, but you seem to suggest this has been notched up one or two levels. What was the answer to your question from your colleague?
Well, first, you know, war is always a brutal and ugly business, but most combatants, at least at most times in the modern world, have at least tried to engage in some kind of discrimination of targets about things like not targeting civilians, not targeting schools, not targeting churches. The Russians have gone out of their way, not just in what they're striking from a distance with bombs, but even on the ground, one-on-one, just shooting unarmed civilians. And the reason I found it puzzling is not because I am naive about war, but because the Russians went into this saying, we are there to save our brothers and sisters. We are one people. We are the same family. And now you have Russians, you know, literally shooting people in the streets. And part of the answer, and I spoke about this with a colleague of mine named Nick Gvozdev, who's a very good Russian expert, and we both kind of tried to puzzle this out. Part of the answer is that the Russians now see Ukrainian resistance to them as betrayal. It's worse than treason. It's a betrayal at a kind of blood ties level. We were supposed to be your brothers and you took up arms against us. So really, you're just no better than Nazis. And now we can just kill you like animals. And I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is that I think the Russians are venting a kind of resentment on the Ukrainians. Why do you live better than us? Why can you choose your own government? Why is it that you think it would be bad to be part of Russia? You know, how is it that you look down on us this way? And I think that has led to an angry Russian military that many of those kids who didn't want to be there in the first place, just becoming sadistically brutal. But it also explains why the high command is following those orders.
You know, Carol,
and I think,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No,
I think Zelensky made that point in his speech, like how you talked about us being brothers and look at how you treated us. I mean, he gave a very emotional speech over the weekend and pointing up how much of a lie the whole thing about Slavic unity and Slavic brotherhood really is.
You know, Tom, what are the signs that will indicate to us what the answer to my first question is in the days ahead as to whether or not this is a one and done kind of moment or whether or not it signaled that the Ukrainians were taking the advantage here? What do we look for?
First thing you're going to look for is a Russian counteroffensive and to see how big and how overarching it is. I mean, the Russians will regroup. I mean, they're not complete idiots. They're going to regroup. They're going to consolidate their forces, and they're almost certainly planning a major counteroffensive at this moment, and we'll have to see how much that succeeds. I think that it also matters how much the Ukrainians manage to consolidate this win. You know, I share Carol's concern about a cold winter, but all of the things that we can start sending to Ukraine, a lot of them are already there, and a lot of them will arrive pretty quickly. I mean, in a way, the stage is being set for the fighting in December or January. It's already being set now. And so we'll just have to see if the Russians are able to rally back. But the home front in Russia is becoming unstable. And that's something, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, Carol, I just didn't think I'd be sitting here saying, yeah, the Russian home front is becoming shaky, but I think it is becoming shaky. The people on Russian media and in the Russian publications, I mean, there's a palpable sense of panic now about what's happening.
Good to hear.
Right.
Speaking of media, can I just ask you one? I only have a minute or so left. One question to both of you, and I think you both know it's an obsession of mine. I'm really disappointed in my colleagues in the media in terms of how much coverage after the initial phase this battle for democracy has gotten, and I guess my angst about it reached fevered proportions when it was and is 24/7 the death of a monarch. Are Harry and Will going to be reunited? Will it be a rapprochement? Carol, starting with you, are you troubled by how the media is or is not covering Ukraine after 200 days?
Well, I even have friends who know what I do come up to me and say, it's not on the front pages of the paper anymore. How are we even supposed to know about what's going on? I agree with you completely. And trying to turn on, any news channel this weekend, it was all about the Queen, and I'm sorry for her death, but
We all are,
it
of course.
had nothing to do with had nothing to do with the battlefield advances that the Ukrainians were making. I think it's terrible, and it goes back to your other question, Jim. It doesn't help Biden rally the troops, so to speak, about getting more aid to Ukraine when it's not on the front pages, which means people are going to forget about it, and so there's not going to be any of that groundswell of support for fighting for democracy.
15 seconds, Tom Nichols.
I agree completely. I loved the Queen as much as any red-blooded American could, but I was really upset that we were talking about who gets the Queen's corgis instead of the fact that an epical battle is unfolding in the middle of Europe. And I actually wrote about it today in the Atlantic because I was so upset about it and I wanted to draw our attention back to it.
By the way, the Washington Post mid-afternoon today, the corgi headline, honest to God, was above the Ukraine headline at the top of the website. Carol Saivetz, Tom Nichols, as always, terrific guidance here and information. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thank you.